Hello, welcome to Good Grazing Makes Sense. I'm Dave Voth, your host. As always, we're brought to you by the Society for Range Management, and we're here looking for where economics and ecology overlap. And if you've been around and you're listening to this episode, chances are you've heard of our guest today, Jim Garish. We're talking mostly about stockpiling feed. Jim Garish, author of Kick the Hay Habit. Likely you've read that book before as well. Jim, can you chime in, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and what you do?
Well, good morning, Dave, and everybody out there. Thanks for the opportunity to visit through this venue. Those of you who don't know me, I guess the quick version is I grew up in Illinois, crop and hog farmer. I got over that. Uh, Spent 22 years on the University of Missouri faculty, working on grazing research, and through 20 plus years of that time, we had our own, my wife and kids and I, we had our own grass farm there together, raised cow calf, raised yearlings, had sheep for 9 years. And then in 2003, I quit the University of Missouri. In 2004, we sold our farm in Missouri, moved out to Idaho, completely recreational lifestyle move because I enjoy hiking in the mountains. After just being a couple months in Idaho, it fell into a deal with one of the ranches in the Pacific Valley and actually ended up spending 19 years managing one unit of a larger ranch. And we grazed 450 acres of center pivot pasture, some flood irrigated land, some desert rangeland. And so I got another whole second education in grazing management in the Western world, as opposed to the high rainfall Midwest. And when I left the university, I went into private business, doing individual farm and ranch consulting. I teach a lot of workshops around the country, speak at a lot of conferences, wrote a few more books, and here I am today on the brink of retirement.
That's a lot of stuff you said, but the thing that blew my mind the most is that 2004 was 21 years ago. That might be the meanest thing I've heard all week.
Yeah,
Um,
time flies when you're having fun, Dave.
it does. It does. It's flying by for me. So one of the big things I read Kick the Hay Habit, and I followed a lot of your work, and the first time I listened to it, I said those words that really grate on me when I hear other people say it. Well, that's fine for Missouri, but that's not going to work here in Elko County. That's not going to work here in the San Juan. I can't be the first person who thought that, and I'm coming around, but it's got to be people's immediate thoughts, some insecurity shining through on how that can't be done here.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot over the years, and literally from East Coast to West Coast, from Mexico into Canada, that that's fine in Missouri, but that won't work here. And the bottom line of that is, if you don't believe it'll work here, it won't, because you will have no commitment to make it work. If you believe, I could do something like that, you will find a way. And for a lot of those people who say, well, that won't work here, usually it turns out somewhere within an hour's drive of them, somebody else is already doing it.
Yeah, I guess let's back up a little bit, just for those who haven't read Kick the Hay Habit or aren't familiar with you. Can we just talk about stockpiling feed and what that means?
Yeah, sure. So, coming back to when I worked at the University of Missouri, basically my research task was to make beef cattle competitive with soybeans on highly erodible land. That's what I was asked to look into. And because I didn't grow up in the cattle business, I had no baggage of how things were supposed to be done. And literally, to start out the process, I looked at the typical Missouri cow calf budget of 1970s, because I started at Missouri January 1st, 1981. So we were looking at these cost of production from the 1970s. And even then, what stood out is your biggest single line item cost was feed, and a big chunk of that was winter feed, which was hay. And sometimes it embarrasses me to admit that some of the first research I worked on in Missouri was better hay storage systems, better hay feeding systems, because, I thought, okay, we have to have hay. We got to be more efficient about how we use it. And then, in a few years' time, I realized, you know what? We don't need to more efficiently use hay. We need to get hay out of our business. And so that led to the research we did in stockpiling pastures and working towards year round grazing. So, stockpiling basically means you grow forage in the growing season and you leave it stand in the field to graze in the dormant season. And so, that very simple concept, whether we are talking about, endophyte infected tall fescue in Missouri and the rest of the Midwest and Southeast, or if we're talking about high desert rangeland in Elko County, Nevada, or Custer County, Idaho, it's the same basic concept. We grow feed in the growing season and then we graze it in the dormant season.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference in quality you're going to see on that stockpile feed versus growing feed?
Okay, so one thing I'm notorious for is saying it depends. And so it very much depends, what are we stockpiling? And I have worked since I went into private business, either consulting or teaching, I've worked in 43 of the 50 states. And so what exactly are we working with to stockpile? It really depends on where we are, and then the quality of the forage that we can stockpile depends on how we grow it, what the species composition is. Two big broad differences between cool season forages and warm season forages. Like where we are in central Idaho, at around 6,000 foot elevation, there is no warm season. So we grow no warm season forages. Everything here is a cool season forage. Now, cool season forages at any stage of maturity have more protein in them than do warm season forages. So in a cool season environment, and we could be looking at, like I say here, central Idaho or Missouri, Wisconsin, Ohio. Now, Missouri is a transitional environment where we could grow a lot of warm season forages and cool season forages. Cool season forages typically preserve their nutritional value better into the winter than do warm season forages. So we very often do not need any protein supplementation if we're stockpiling a cool season forage. Now that could be, a western wheatgrass dominant range side, rough fescue, Idaho fescue, any of those cool season forages probably do not need protein supplementation. They may need some energy supplementation at some point in the winter, but usually not protein. Warm season forages, on the other hand, are typically substantially lower in protein. And if we are stockpiling a warm season forage for winter use, you're almost guaranteed that you will need protein supplementation at some point in the winter. So that's one of the first big differences. Is it a cool season or is it a warm season?
What about the energy level on those warm season grasses, on stockpiled warm season grasses?
Okay, that's highly variable. If you are in a semi-arid environment and it's a once a year grazing event, so you might be stockpiling a warm season pasture for the entire growing season, that is probably going to be both energy and protein deficient. So if we're using that as, the base roughage of the diet, we're going to have to provide a supplement that provides both protein and energy. And that could be alfalfa hay. That could be like Stiller's grain, corn gluten feed. It depends on, where in the country we are and what byproducts we have or what supplemental crops we have that we might use for that protein and energy supplement. Now, if we go to a little higher rainfall environment, and I'll say anything, that's got more than 15, 18 inches of annual precip. There, we could take a warm season grass and graze it fairly early in the growing season, allow it to regrow. And if what we're grazing in the wintertime is the mid to late summer regrowth on that warm season grass, it may have enough protein for a late gestation non-lactating cow. Now, you're not going to grow yearlings on it. You're not going to fall calve and graze that stuff in the wintertime, but it could be adequate, both energy and protein, for a cow that is calving on green grass in the true spring. So not only does the forage type make a difference on what we want to stockpile, but also what is the class of animal that we're going to be putting out there. That needs to be, that's an important consideration in what and how we choose to stockpile something. Now, in the irrigated West, and this is where a lot of outfits that I've worked with have made the change. They've realized that the cost of turning that, pivot irrigated forage into hay is just too costly. And so they've gone to grazing it and then stockpiling some of that irrigated land for winter grazing. And that might, if it's a grass dominant pasture, they might just leave it standing and graze it as standing true stockpile. If it's alfalfa dominant, then generally we're going to advise them to put it into swaths and then graze the swaths in the wintertime. So you can see there's just a whole lot of it depends in your days.
I've found it depends has been taken over by it depends on your context. I hear that a lot now. That's the new answer for everything. I've got a ton of questions just off of what you already said. And the one that I'm just going to go right to it is the calving on green grass. Are you a proponent of calving in sync with nature? Obviously, it depends on your context, but does that play a major role in extending your forage?
Yeah, but I generally say calve in relation to your forage supply, not necessarily calve in sync with nature. And in the Center Mountain West region, I would lean much more towards calve in sync with nature. But I'm going to give two examples where calving way out of sync with nature makes more sense because we've created unnatural forage supply systems. First one, let's go down to like Southeast Texas, down towards the Gulf Coast, where a cold day in the winter is 50 degrees, and they grow annual ryegrass is a real common feed there. Now, the base pastures in that area are, of course, all warm season. They tend to be non-native warm seasons. They're introduced subtropicals that have really low forage quality as they mature. But if you have annual ryegrass that starts growing in January, and the best forage quality you have all year is the annual ryegrass in March and April, maybe into May, calving in January makes perfect sense there. There's not very many other places in the country where I can say calving in January makes perfect sense. But if you have an unnatural forage base that's very productive and high quality, then don't calve in sync with nature, calve in sync with your forage supply. The other example I would use is endophyte infected tall fescue through the lower Midwest and the upper South. Because the toxicity of the fescue is most severe in spring and early summer, calving in sync with nature on infected fescue may not be a good idea. Tall fescue is different from a lot of cool season plants in that it has its highest energy content. It's its best nutrition in the fall and early winter, not in the spring. And because tall fescue is also the very best grass in a productive environment for stockpiling for winter grazing, fall calving makes real good sense in a endophyte infected fescue environment. When I was in Missouri at the research station there, we ran fall calving cows through the entire winter on nothing but stockpiled fescue pastures and did very, very well with it. And so tall fescue is not a native to North America. So we've brought this plant in, changed the pattern of natural forage distribution to an artificial distribution, which has a toxicity problem in the spring, but not so much in fall and winter. And so in that situation, we are calving way out of sync with nature, but we're calving in sync with our forage supply.
I dislike it when range people get into semantics, but I think you just pointed out a really good reason to get into the nitty gritty on that one. What you're saying is very true. Calving in sync with nature is not a great way to say that, but it does lead me to the question, and I'm going to show my ignorance on tall fescue areas. What is wildlife doing in those areas? How are they getting through?
Okay. To fight infected Kentucky 31 tall fescue is not very attractive to wildlife. And it's one we did a lot of work in when I was at the University of Missouri at the Forage Systems Research Center. We did a lot of work reseeding native warm season grasses as an alternative to having all of this tall fescue around. So tall fescue monocultures and typical production pattern historically for those was 3 or 4 shots of nitrogen fertilizer over the course of the year because it's a grass that responds very well production-wise to nitrogen. But the flip side of that is the more nitrogen fertilizer you put on infected tall fescue, the more toxic it becomes. So it's very much a double-edged sword that you're looking at there. Once you take the nitrogen fertilizer away, improve the grazing management, and the key things are get the fescue kind of suppressed in the spring with some early aggressive grazing, and then go to longer recovery periods. And we brought native grass back, not by seeding it, but what was residual remnant prairie seed still in the soil. We just gave it the opportunity to express itself. So we took fields that were literally 90% tall fescue composition, and through change in grazing management, created a broad diversity of species out there to where we ended up with only about 30% tall fescue in there. The value of that 30% tall fescue that's still left in those pastures is very good to stockpile for winter feed, and that the 30% fescue composition actually provides kind of protection for a lot of the other species, a little lower growing, but that won't withstand winter freezing if it's just, those softer plants out by themselves. But with the tall fescue canopy there, mixed pasture made very, very good winter feed for cattle, but it also created much, much better environment for all forms of wildlife, whether we're talking about, ground nesting birds, the deer coming in and using it. Yeah, creating that, just moving away from strong fescue dominance. You can still have fescue out there, but you get diversity in there, and then it becomes much, much better wildlife situation.
I'm not a wildlife guy, and I always forget about nesting birds.
Oh,
They're a major part of our wildlife system.
and they're an important component of the ecosystem when we think about fly control, internal parasite control. The greater your bird populations are in a pasture and a rangeland situation, the lower the parasite infections and risks are going to be, because birds literally eat that shit and take all the larvae and eggs out of it. This is why in these regenerative farms and ranches that are adding poultry to like layers following your cow herd, those layers are basically cleaning out the parasites from the manure, and it gives you another enterprise and revenue stream. But to me, the much more important part of layers out in a pasture following the cow herd or the sheep flock around is that they can all but eliminate the labor cost and the product cost of deworming these animals, and not to mention the ecological cost to non-target organisms that we get from using insecticides, parasiticides on our livestock.
all while creating income off of another enterprise.
Correct. Yeah.
You don't see a win-win very often, but that does seem like a win-win-win. I want to shift gears and move away from the tall fescue area and into like our public land states. When we talk about stockpiling feed, we often complain about whether or not we're talking about stockpiling feed, we often complain about federal regulations on grazing.
Mm-hmm.
How can and and every situation is different, but out here in the West, it seems like a lot of our situations are the same. We turn cattle out in March, we bring them back in October, November. What's the best? What have you seen people do for stockpiling feed in these public land situations? Just save their
Okay.
private feed stockpile?
Like in the environment where we are, most Forest Service grazing permits are not, the land just simply isn't accessible in the winter months due to snow, roads being blocked, all of those things. So the Forest Service grazing, we are probably pretty well locked into growing season use on most of the forest. BLM, on the other hand, we have a lot of lower elevation, foothills landscape, desert landscape, where it is winter accessible. And one thing that I have found, most range scientists, whether they are academics, private business, or within agencies, most range scientists will admit that one of the best tools for restoring rangeland health is switching it to dormant season grazing. Let's allow this plant community the entire growing season to express itself, to reinvigorate itself, and then let's use it in the wintertime. And I have seen a lot of private rangeland that has been vastly improved when they went to grazing their hay ground, grazing those during the entire growing season, and then wintering on rangeland. And a key part of making that system work and where you gain the greatest financial benefit from it is if your cow herd is calving on that green forage in spring and early summer. Okay.
Mhm.
So that really works. There have been some ranchers who have been able to work with their BLM resource people and get their permits changed from summer use to winter use. And usually, financially, the ranch is better off. Ecologically, the public land is better off doing that. Now, that is a district to district variation in response. Within some districts, the BLM employees are willing to work with ranchers to make those changes because they recognize that from a resource management standpoint, it is beneficial to the public lands that they're managing. But it means you have to go up the chain of command getting permission to make these changes or authorization to make these changes. Some district offices are willing to do that. Other district offices, they simply don't want the hassle of ever having to change anything. They would rather just stick with, well, this is the way we've always done it, and just go with that, even if they may not recognize the value to the resource of making that change, or they might recognize that it'd be valuable, but man, I don't want the headaches. And this is kind of funny. So if you have a fresh out of college BLM employee who hasn't worked 20 years within the system and gotten beaten down, they can be very enthusiastic about doing what's right for the resource. Or you have the guy or gal who's within 2 years of retirement and they're done being beaten down. And as you know, their final step in the agency, their legacy is we're going to do something that's right. But man, you get the people who are between 10 years and 25 years employment in the agency, and that's where you find most of the I don't want to rock the boat people. So once again, you know what we're back to? It depends. And in this case, it depends on the human factor of who it is that we're working with at the agency level.
I've heard a number of times all problems are people problems, and I find it to be true more and more. In this kind of market we're dealing with right now, and I know it's a crazy time, but cattle are worth so much money and hay is taking a big decline. Is it prudent to go with a stockpiling system or to remain flexible to take advantage of this type of situation where the numbers might show it's cheaper to run $150 hay through more cattle than it is to stockpile feed and maybe reduce your numbers?
Okay, a lot of that cost effectiveness depends on how you are managing that stockpiled feed. And once again, we could look at the rangeland scenario. We can look at the productive environment scenario, which means either irrigated land out here west or the more productive high rainfall areas in the east. And I'm going to start with the example of the more productive land in the east. Grazing stockpiled fescue was not a new idea that I came up with in 1981. There had been research on stockpiling and winter grazing fescue done in this country in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And so when I came to the Forage Systems Research Center, they were already stockpiling fescue and grazing it some in the winter, but they were only harvesting about 40 AUDs per acre. And if we call winter 120 days, which is in Missouri what we consider 120 to 130 days is what we considered to be winter, it would take 3+ acres to carry a cow through the winter on stockpiled fescue. You look at the cost of hay back in those days, and feeding hay was way cheaper than tying up 3 acres as stockpile. At the time I left Missouri, we were running a cow to the acre, harvesting 120 to 130 AUDs per acre in stockpiled pasture. And that was not giving up any of the use from April to August. It was just a change in stock policy and how we were using that. So we went from 3 acres to winter a cow to 1 acre to winter a cow, and suddenly it made much more economic sense. Now, if we come out here to the west and look at the grazing situation, so I have some clients that each fall we do a rangeland inventory with. And this is so they can plan their winter grazing program. And the two outfits so 2 weeks ago, I was at a place in Wyoming and we inventoried 14,000 acre winter range unit. I've been working with this client for nearly 10 years now. And it's been one of my most fun jobs to go do is just go out with this guy. And usually, there'll be 2 or 3 other people join us to learn the process. And basically, once he started inventorying and this is entire growing season rest because it's in a dry location, he's got the entire growing season pretty well to create his winter feed supply. And he didn't used to have good stock water distribution. He had very little interior fencing. And so there were 14,000 acres there, but it might be you turn the herd out on 4,000 acres and you leave them there till, basically it's gone. But the basically it's gone is within a half a mile of water.
Mm-hmm.
And out there a mile and a half away, you might still have lots of feed standing, but close to water was getting hammering so bad. So he changed, he did stock water development, put in subdivision fencing. He knows exactly how much feed he has there, and he's essentially doubled the number of cattle that he can carry in the winter. The other way of looking at that is saying he has cut in half the acres per cow that it takes to go stockpile through. Next week, I'm going to a place in central Montana. We're going to do the same thing. I think that unit is about 17,000 acres. And we've only been doing this, I think it will be our 3rd year on this ranch doing that same deal. But, he has seen the same thing that, man, I need better water distribution. Man, I need to be able to control where these cattle are. And, he's incrementally seeing that increase in AUDs per acre that we can harvest off of that. So whether we're in that productive environment or out here on the range, having an objective of grazing as many days of the year as possible, and then a plan of how you're going to accomplish that, and making sure that you can use every one of those acres effectively through the winter through stock water availability and fence to control. So one of these places, well, both of these places are considering virtual fencing for better, even tighter control in the wintertime. Because even on a variable landscape, even if you have every acre of it within a half mile of water, you still end up with some uneven use, missed opportunities. And so they're now looking at virtual fencing as a tool for fine tuning that winter management. I know I just did a grazing school in Nebraska last month, far western Nebraska, and the rancher there, same objective of grazing year round, eliminate hay feeding completely. And he is already into using virtual fencing to control that winter feed. And there we're talking about getting to the level of basically drawing your virtual fence line along soil type changes because you have different plant communities, different grazing opportunities. And we would never be able to cost effectively fence a ranch with conventional fencing in that way. But the opportunities to fine tune winter grazing management with virtual fence, I think it's going to be a huge game changer.
I am really excited
My
about
family
virtual
business,
fence.
your family business, American Grazing Land Services, we sell conventional electric fencing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be 70 in February. I plan to be mostly retired, but I see that, man, our business needs to move into virtual fencing of some sort because I think it is the future.
I agree. I'm cautiously optimistic about it, and I always say cautiously because I'm worried too many people are thinking it's a silver bullet and going to try and
Mhm.
replace management. But I'm very excited about what it can do. So as usual, we've passed the 30-minute mark, and I could go on for a couple more hours. Jim, I want to thank you for being on here. For those of you listening, if you haven't read Kick the Hay Habit, give it a read. Jim, I'm going to beg you to get it on Audible so we can start listening it to in our tractors and our trucks.
It's not on Audible, but Kick the Hay Habit is the only one of my books that was available on CD.
Was it?
It is available as an audio book, and my sales pitch on the Kick the Hay Habit audio book is you can listen to this while you mow hay, while you bale hay, while you feed hay, and maybe you'll figure out this can make a difference.
That's great, Jim. I know you're doing. I see on Facebook you're doing some schools. Can you want to take a minute to plug what you've got coming up?
Okay, first thing I want to plug is so I mentioned, our family business, American Grazing Land Services. The website for that is americangrazinglands.com. And there's a lot of educational material we have up there. We also have an online store for electric fencing, stock water supplies, livestock weighing equipment. We're in the forage seed business also. We do not grow seed, we do not inventory seed. But my wife, Dawn, she formulates custom. She does all of our seeding recommendations based on, soil types, environment, all of those kind of things. So she does really detailed work on getting a custom seed mix. She's not planning on retiring next year. So we do those. So American Grazing Land Services. Upcoming events that I have in later this month, I've got two-day workshops coming up in Kansas. I believe those are like the 20th, 21st in Salina, Kansas, 22nd, 3rd at Riley, Kansas. And I have not put those on our, website calendar yet. This should stimulate me to get that up there. And then the following week, I'm in Kentucky, speaking at the University of Kentucky Fall Grazing Conference. It's 2 locations, one day in Winchester, Kentucky, one day in Litchfield, Kentucky. And I'm also doing a profitability workshop at Elizabethtown, Kentucky. And let me just pop my calendar. Well, it's out there. I'll get that information, put to our website, and I'll go ahead and email it to you, Dave. And
You bet.
then if you post
We'll
that
put it
kind of
right in
stuff
here.
at the end of it, it'll be there.
Yep, we'll put
Actually, I
all that
almost
stuff
got
in.
one, and I don't know how soon this will be live and available, but actually this Saturday, the 11th of October, I'll be at an evening meeting at Wilsaw, Montana, with Mountain Valley Vet Services, Ben Bennett, and that's going to be an evening dinner meeting. But man, it doesn't sound like I'm slowing down to retire, does it?
That's what I was just thinking. This does not sound like a man who's about to retire.
Yeah. But once I'm done at Litchfield, Kentucky, I have nothing else the rest of the year.
I'm sure nothing else will come up. Good luck with that.
Yeah. I'll try to avoid doing anything else the rest of the year.
One last question before we call it a day. I know that your books are at the top of many of my friends' list of must reads. So what's at the top of Jim Garish's must read list?
Okay, if you're serious about grazing management, the must read book, and to me, it is the most significant book on grazing management written in the 20th century. That is Grass Productivity by Andre Voisin.
I have not even heard of it. I'm looking forward to that one.
Okay. Everything I talk about, Andre Voisin wrote about 60, 70 years ago. Most of what Alan Savory talks about in terms of grazing management, that all comes out of Andre Voisin. The holistic decision model, holistic management decision model, that is largely Alan's product and legacy, but the basics of grazing management, I think anyone who's roughly my age or a little older who, is more into the time management basis of grazing, we're all largely influenced and strongly influenced by Andre Voisin.
I think I read that somewhere, or maybe I heard Joel Salatin say it or something. That's going to be the first thing I do once we hang up is go find that book.
It's hard to find.
Great, and
I don't
probably
think
probably even harder in auto.
Yeah, I don't think anyone is currently reprinting that book these days. You can find used copies online, I would imagine.
Okay. Well, Jim, I thank you so much for your time. I'm honored you joined us today. People will be seeing this and probably reaching out with questions, so I might be picking your brain via email on some of these questions that come our way from this
Okay.
conversation.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity and thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you. If and just hang tight.